friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the Kiwi Critters stamp set by Blade for MFT stamps. And I'm going to be coloring to match some pattern paper from the Echo Park Our Baby 6x6 pad. So I'll just add a scrap underneath my cardstock panel so I can pull my color palette from there. I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers. So I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink. I'm going to hop right in with my kangaroo, pun intended, and I'm going to use some E30s for him. So I'm starting with E33, E35, and E37 to match the browns in that pattern paper. They're really rich and warm and kind of golden toned, so I thought the E30s would be perfect for that. Starting with my E37 and laying in some shadows around the inner part of the ears, the top of the head, the underside of the arms, and along the left side of the body, since he's facing a little bit more toward the right. And except for the face, which is pretty much front on, so that has the shading on equal sides. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E37. And then I'll come in with that E33 and fill in the rest of the body with the exception of the face. There's no line that separates the face from the belly area, so I wanted the center of the face to be a little bit lighter and kind of gradually fade into the belly. So I'll bring in E30 and E31 for that. I'm going to use little circular motions around the face to make sure to blend that E31 into the E33. Take that down onto the belly and again shade that on the left hand side. And then I'll use that E30 to fill in the rest of that. The kangaroo's pouch wasn't standing out quite enough for me, so I did a second layer starting with the E33, blended out with the E31 and then the E30. And then I also did a second layer on the darker part of the kangaroo just to smooth out the blend. Then I'll move on to my koala, and I'm going to use W00, W1, W3, and W5. I went with the warm grays for him to match with that pattern paper. Even though there's no gray in the pattern paper, it is all rich warm tones, so I thought the warm grays went the best. So I started with the W5 for my shadows, and I did it pretty much even on both the left and the right because he's mainly facing forward. The lower part of his body is just slightly tilted toward the left, but it's mainly forward, so it's pretty much even. I just did my shading on the feet both on the right hand side since they're pointed to the left. I blended out the W5 with the W3 and then brought in the W1 to finish off his body. And then for the white parts of him, so the inner parts of the ear and the belly, I'm going to use just a touch of that W1 and blend that out with the W00. And I did do a second layer on him off screen as well. For his nose, I used W7 and W9, starting with the W9 on the right, blended out with the W7, and then went back in with a little more of that W9. And then I'm going to move on to my platypus, and I wanted him to be brown, but I didn't want to use the same brown as the kangaroo or what I will use for the tree. So I decided to go with the E40s. They're kind of like a mix between brown and gray, like a grayish. So I thought that that would suit well with the other two animals. It's kind of like the in-between. So I used E42, E43, E44 and E47 for his body, starting with the E47, and again he's facing completely forward, so his shading is going to be equal on both the left and the right. Once I had my shadows laid in, I blended out with the E44, and then I'm coming in with the E43. And again, just making those little circular motions to break up the previous shade so I don't get any harsh lines. I left a little bit of area on the lower part of the face and on the center of the belly for the highlight, which is the E42. And once I have that filled in, I'm going to bring in some darker shades for the tails. So I did look up pictures of platypuses before I colored this. So I knew that the tail is darker. So I brought in E47 and E49, started at the bottom with the E49, blended up with the E47, and then used the E44 for the highlight. And then the beak and feet were kind of like this gray tone as well, but a little bit more gray than brown. So I decided to use the E70s for that. And I went with E70, E71, and E74. So I'm going to do all of those with that, starting with the E74, blending out with the E71, and I'll use the E70 for the highlight. I love these critters. I think they're so cute. That platypus is especially darling. Then I'm going to give all of these guys some rosy cheeks using R11 and R20. I started with the R20, adding a little oval shape to the cheek area, and then I'm going to go around that with the R11 to blend that out. It wasn't showing up quite dark enough on the kangaroo or the platypus, so I decided to bring in the R22 and just add a tiny bit of that to the center to darken it up. And then I threw it on the koala as well and just blended that out with the R20 once again. And then I'll go back in with my R11 to make sure that that just fades into the rest of their fur. Then I'm going to move on to my tree. I'll use E23, E25, and E27. Starting with the E27, I'm going to do some shading down around the grasses at the base of the tree, and then I'll add it on the sides of the tree and the underside of the branches. I don't want to get too heavy-handed with the darkest shades, so I'm trying to do thin lines there, and then I'll start blending that out with the E25. Just carefully going over the edge of the previous shade, although it doesn't have to be blended perfectly for wood because there is a little bit of texture and variation in wood. So I don't mind if a little bit of that isn't completely blended out. I'm also going to be adding some details to this in just a sec once this is finished. And for that, I'm going to bring in E29. And I'm just going to add in some little swirls and dash lines to fill in the tree and give it those grooves that you would normally see, and just give it a bit more personality. Then for the leaves, I'm going to bring in some green tones to match the greens in that pattern paper, which are kind of like a cool sage green. So I used E40, E43, and E46. Starting with the E46 at the base of each of those leaves, I'm adding a little bit of darkness there. And then once I have those filled in, I'll come in with the G43 and just start to blend that out, making sure to pull that darkest shade into the middle of the leaf. But I'm saving a little bit of room on the ends of the leaves for my highlight, which is going to be the G40. The G40 has a nice kind of light brightness that I really love. It almost looks like there's light filtering through those leaves. So I love adding that to this combo. And I just think it suits that pattern paper really well. And then I'm going to do the grasses down at the bottom with the same tones. The grasses are mostly going to be covered up in the design that I'm doing. So I wasn't too worried about them matching the leaves exactly because, yeah, like I said, you're not going to see very much of it anyway. So I'm just shading that in the same way, starting with the darkest, blending out with the mid-tone, and then adding a little bit of highlight. And then I will grab a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and go over the eyes of my critters. This just makes them nice and bright and shiny again. It just brings your critters to life. And then I'll trim these images out with their matching dyes. For my background, I have die cut a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock with the third largest of the MFT A2 stitch rectangle stacks set 2. And I'm going to do a simple watercolor background on this panel. So I'm starting with some scattered straw distress oxide ink, adding that to an acrylic block, and then I can dip my paintbrush into some water and paint that onto the panel. I'm staying away from the edges. I want to keep those white, so I'm just working in the center there and bringing that about 2/3 of the way down. And then I will bring in some rustic wilderness. And I'm also going to add to that a little bit of cracked pistachio to give it that kind of cooler tone like the pattern paper had. So I'm going to blend those two together to kind of create my own shade, and then I'll add that to the bottom third of that panel. And then once I have a good bit of that laid in there, I will start to bring that up and almost blend it with the yellow that I've added above. So I'm just painting that on there, trying to make the transition look a bit more seamless. And I even decided to blot a little bit up with a paper towel and just add a second layer in there. I let that dry, and now I want to come in with some splatter detail using Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink. I switched to a thin paintbrush so that I can get super fine little droplets. So I'm just mixing that ink up with some water and then tapping that all over the background. I want some of the splatter to be on the white areas as well, just to kind of pull the whole thing together. So I'm making sure to move that around and just tap it against my finger until I'm happy with how it's looking. I set that aside until it was dry and then popped it in my MISTI so I could work on my sentiment. And I'm using the one that says, "Have a good day, mate." But I have to be really careful because that background did warp a bit, and so it keeps popping up from the MISTI, and I have to make sure that there's no ink that is kind of like in the corners that could get smudged there. And then for my card base, I'm using some Lawn Fawn craft cardstock and stamping on the inside in walnut ink. And I'm going to do the little kiwi, which I love, and the "I'm super stoked for you" sentiment. So I stamped that down a couple of times to make sure it was nice and dark. And then I will set that aside. Then I'm going to grab that pattern paper pad once again and pick a couple of prints that I want to use on this card. I wanted to combine 3 different prints. So first I was looking at this sunshine print. I thought that would be fun for a card set in Australia, but I didn't want to use it in a large amount, so I decided to go with the plaid that I had used as my inspiration, but just a bigger piece of it. Then I also pulled out another sage green print and the sunshine print. So these are the 3 that I'm going to be using. So I will trim these down with my paper trimmer. And then I can add these to the front of my card. So the plaid print is going to cover the entire card front, which is a A2 standard size card, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And then I'm going to take the sunshine print, which is trimmed down to 2 1/4 inches wide, and I'll run that down the center of the card vertically. And then I'll take the sage green polka dot and run that across the center of the card horizontally. So then I'm just going to add a whole bunch of foam tape to the back of the focal panel to help it kind of flatten out since it was warped. And then I will center that on my card, making sure I have the equal amount showing on all 4 sides, and then press that down into place. Then I'll bring in my images and I can start to adhere those down using my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue, making sure to get behind all of the little leaves as well, so that will be really well adhered. And then I'm going to add that tree over on the right hand side, making sure not to cover up any of the sentiment. And then I'll add my kangaroo right to the left of that, just below the sentiment. I'll have my platypus at the base of the tree over on the right. And then my koala is going to go down in the center towards the bottom edge of that focal panel. So I'm just going to add some liquid glue to the back of him and adhere that down. And these guys are just so cute. They just make me smile. And because this was a more masculine card and I wasn't quite sure who I was going to send it to yet, I decided not to add any glitter. So that is going to finish this one off. There is another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button. You can leave me a comment down below. I love to hear from you. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell if you'd like to be alerted when I post new videos. All of the products I use will be listed and linked in the description bar below the video in case you'd like to pick up anything for yourself. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I will see you soon in another video. Bye-bye!